I have to confess, the release of the Steinberg IXO22 took me a bit by surprise, as Steinberg already has their well-known URC lineup in place, which feels like has been released just 2 years ago.
It was 2019, you're getting old.
What? Anyways, the IXO devices seem to be a separate interface series, and it's going to be very interesting to see how they perform. Hey, Julian Kraus here, and I guess it's no secret that when I reviewed the legendary Steinberg UR22C that I had some criticism in 2 main areas: headphone output impedance and preamp noise. Let's take a closer look at the IXO22, see if there have been any improvements, and of course compare it directly to a few other interfaces, including Steinberg's own UR22C and offerings from Focusrite and Audient. Let's go. Oh, and quick note, I bought the IXO22 with my own money, and this video is not sponsored. But I want to give a quick shout out to all my awesome Patreons for supporting my gear acquisition syndrome. Thank you very much. Okay, quick hardware overview. The IXO22 pretty much looks like your typical 2-channel interface. Here I got the black version, but a white version is also available. And there's also a smaller version available with just 1 microphone input called the IXO12. I do expect this interface to fare similarly as the IXO22, but I haven't tested it yet, so I can't be certain. On the front of the IXO22 you get 2 XLR and TRS combo inputs, which accept microphone or line level signals. To mention is that compared to other interfaces, these inputs cannot be toggled to an instrument input, and for that the IXO22 has a separate 1/4-inch TS connection. Despite the 3 inputs, the interface can only record with 2 sources at a time. Interestingly, you can find a mute button per channel on the front, which completely drops the audio from the channel, which can be really quite handy in live streaming situations, like for example somebody running into your room yelling your social security number, then a mute button is a pretty good idea. The IXO22 has a few more buttons, one to turn on phantom power for both inputs simultaneously, and a monitoring button. With the latter you can do 2 things, either turn direct monitoring on in mono, on in stereo or off, and you can also toggle loopback with the same button. With direct monitoring you can hear the audio of your inputs in your headphones and monitors without any delay, and the stereo feature can be really quite handy in, you guessed it, a stereo recording situation. And the loopback feature allows you to record the output of your PC's audio in addition to the 2 inputs of the IXO22. You also get a 2/4-inch headphone connection and a few knobs to control things like the input gain, headphone and main output volume. Speaking of which, the main outputs are on the back in form of 2 1/4-inch balanced connections. There are also 2 USB-C connections, one to hook up the interface to a PC or an iOS device. Important note, the Lightning to USB-C cable that often comes with iPhones does not work, and instead you have to use the provided USB-C to USB Type-A cable with a USB-A to Lightning camera adapter. That's at least what it says in the manual. I don't have this adapter laying around, so I have to take Steinberg's word for that. Steinberg also didn't say anything about Android devices, but I could play back audio with the IXO22 connected to a Samsung S20 just fine. Although recording was a bit tricky, as with the majority of apps you get a horrendous amount of noise. But that's certainly an Android issue, as I have the same problem with other interfaces as well. If the connected device does not provide enough power to drive the IXO22, you can simply connect a smartphone charger or battery bank with the second USB-C connection. But that's its only function, you cannot connect this interface to 2 PCs or something like that. Quick look inside. The first thing I noticed was that Steinberg did not go for the standard route with Cirrus Logic, AKM or ESS converters, like many other manufacturers do. They instead used Burr Brown AD and DA chips, which again is going to be really interesting in terms of audio quality, and we will definitely have a look at a few measurements later. A nice touch is the shielding. The top is already protected by the metal housing, but the front, underside and backside are additionally surrounded by a metal foil. In all my tries to induce interference into this interface, it did not pick up anything, which is exactly how it should be. Overall, the build quality is pretty decent. As mentioned, the housing is largely out of metal, only the front and rear and the bottom of the interface are plastic. The knobs are plastic as well, but they turn smoothly and feel alright. One thing I'm not the biggest fan of is the placement of the knobs. They are quite close together, and turning the smaller knobs like the right channel gain and the headphone volume knob can be a bit tricky, especially when you have a guitar or headphones plugged into the interface. In my testing, I also found that the gain shoots up quite rapidly in the last few percent of the gain knob, and this can make it a bit tricky to control the gain precisely. Just something to be aware of. Okay, let's dive into the audio quality of the mic inputs, and in the meantime I would highly appreciate a thumbs up, and please subscribe while you're at it. Of course, everything you hear is recorded with the IXO22, and I'm also going to show you some measurements to see how it compares to a few other interfaces. The frequency response is really quite flat, even at the maximum gain setting. This means that all frequencies are recorded equally well, and that's exactly what you want to see. At a typical gain setting for condenser mics, the response improves ever so slightly, but truth be told, the response is good at all gain settings. One big point of critique on the UR22C was the preamp noise. This is important for when you're recording with dynamic microphones, because these mics need a lot of amplification, and this brings out the noise. That's why I'm currently using an SM7B, as this is a notoriously low sensitive mic, which is a worst case scenario for any preamp. And what can we hear? Nothing, really, and that's a good thing, because the mic preamps have been significantly improved from the UR22C. My IXO22 comes in at minus 130 dB UA weighted, and that puts it firmly in the top performing interfaces. As you can see, this is nearly 10 decibels better than the UR22C, which is a massive and very audible upgrade. Here is a quick boosted comparisons of a few interfaces. Steinberg actually only stated the preamp noise with minus 128 dB UA weighted, but in practice the interface seems to perform better, and this is really good news because the IXO22's preamps also deliver a really nice amount of gain, so there is no need for a cloud-fed header or any other inline preamp. They are literally a waste of money with this interface, which is exactly how it should be. Good job, Steinberg. Distortion-wise, the input also fares very well, with pretty much all distortion components drowning in the noise flow of the interface. The only thing I noticed is that the input clips ever so slightly before hitting 0 dBFS, and you can see this by the line shooting off just before hitting 0. But that's hardly an issue in practice, as you leave yourself some headroom, meaning that your audio is usually peaking around minus 18 dBFS. So all good. Speaking of headroom, you want the interface to have a good amount of dynamic range, which leaves yourself the possibility to leave headroom without introducing additional noise. Here the IXO22 comes in with 107.5 dBA, which is decent. I would still say that this amount of dynamic range is plenty for most recording situations, especially for things like vocals. This is already more than you need. But in very dynamic recording situations, like close mic'd drums, you might be hitting the limits of the IXO22. For the year that we are living, I would have hoped to see a slightly higher amount of dynamic range, simply because other manufacturers can pull it off too. Really not much else to add for the line level inputs. The frequency response is nice and flat in the audible range. The distortions are at a level which I deem to be inaudible, and in terms of dynamic range, it's the same with about 107 dBA. As mentioned for the mic inputs, this is a decent amount of dynamic range, which will be sufficient for most recording scenarios. But purely from a technical standpoint, I would have liked to see an increased performance. But overall, the line level input quality is pretty good. Jumping to the output side, the frequency response is pretty much as flat as possible. No further comments here, this is essentially perfection. The dynamic range came in at 108.5 dBA, which again is a solid performance. This cannot compete with other interfaces that have pushed the boundaries with dynamic ranges over 120 decibels. But let's be real here, the IXO22's dynamic range is already good enough, and I highly doubt that you will ever hear any noise from the output. So on paper it is not perfect, but in practice just fine. Distortion is pretty similar. The THD versus amplitude graph shows a good performance, nothing groundbreaking, but distortions are low enough to not be audible, especially because the majority of distortion components are second order harmonics, which are masked by human hearing anyways. What I'm trying to say is that while the distortion and the noise performance are not perfect, there is really no chance that you will hear this under real world conditions. The sound quality is really quite good. Don't worry about it. The story continues with the headphone output. If we have a look at my comparison chart, you can see that it is mostly green with some yellow sprinkled in between. I am not going to go through all of this, but the important points are that the frequency response is very flat, and the nice part is that it stays flat regardless of the connected headphone impedance, because the IXO22's headphone output now has an output impedance of about 0.2 ohms. This is excellent, especially because the UR22C had a ridiculously high output impedance of 90 ohms, which could very audibly impact the sound quality. With the 0.2 ohms, the IXO22 has been pretty much perfected in this aspect now. Hats off to Steinberg for going this route. In terms of power, the IXO22 should be able to handle most headphones. Only very high impedance ones might not get loud enough, depending on your application, but most headphones should be fine. For the measurement experts here, I'll flip through a few more measurements, and I can say again that in terms of technical performance, the IXO22 wouldn't win any awards, but in practice this is already more than good enough, and I doubt that you will ever perceive any noise or distortion with the IXO22. The only thing I wouldn't recommend is to use IEMs with the IXO22 because they are more sensitive and then you might hear some underlying hiss. But with over-ear headphones this shouldn't be an issue. This is where we normally have a detailed look at the software together, but there's actually not that much to show. The IXO22 is a pretty basic interface in the software feature area, and you essentially only get this control panel which lets you set up things like the sample rate, buffer size, latency mode, and that's about it. So no channel mixer, no audio processing, no adjustment of the LED's brightness, nothing. This is as bare bones as it gets in terms of software. But the question is the round trip latency any good? This is important, for example, when you use an amp sync with your guitar to not hear any delay. Here are the numbers with different buffer sizes and with a 48 kHz sample rate. And I was a bit surprised. While about 7 milliseconds is probably still okay in practice, it is nearly double of what the fastest interfaces can do. You can shave off about 1 more millisecond by setting the latency mode to low latency at the increased risk of crackling audio. With 192 kHz, the performance looks pretty similar, definitely one of the longer measured times, which can get a bit lower with the low latency mode. So not great, not terrible, but I would have liked to see a better RTL performance here, and maybe Steinberg can improve that with future software updates. Oh, by the way, the direct monitoring goes through an AD and DA conversion, and that has about 1 milliseconds of delay. That's inaudible in practice, but I wanted to mention it here for completeness. Before wrapping this up, let's talk about the pros and cons of the IXO22. On the plus side, you get a mute button for each of the two inputs, which can be quite handy. The interface has a second port to power it when you're on the go, and this allows it to be used with iOS devices, besides the typical use as a PC interface. It's really nice to see that the IXO22 has been improved and now has ultra low noise preamps, which are great when using dynamic microphones. The headphone output impedance is really low, which has been a concern on the UR22C, and the IXO22 now beats most interfaces in this aspect. On the negative side, I'm missing the mix knob that could be found on the UR22C or a software solution to dial in direct monitoring. The IXO22 just has a simple button for that. The interface also does not have any MIDI connections, which is something to keep in mind. And from an ergonomic perspective, the knobs are a tad too close together for my liking. Let's sum this all up. The Steinberg IXO22 is a basic interface in terms of features, but with good specs where it counts. This makes the IXO22 really quite easy to use, and I'm pleasantly surprised that Steinberg has addressed my criticisms with the UR22C. Because of that, I much prefer the IXO22, as the aforementioned improvements can make a noticeable difference in quality to your recordings and headphone playback. Probably the biggest strength of the IXO22 is that it does not have any major downsides. In all my tests, there is usually one thing when interface has a bigger issue, be it output impedance, excessive distortion, or whatever, but the IXO22 is simply good enough in pretty much everything. I think the IXO22 does not push any boundaries in terms of technical performance, and it also does not provide any sophisticated software features, but it is a solid choice for when you need an interface that just works. So if you're searching for a simple 2-channel interface, the IXO22 might be the right choice for you. Okay, that's it for now. If this was useful to you, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one.